just welcoming you on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center. It, of course, is a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, and he was very keen on bringing together the world of ideas and the world of practitioners, the world of policy. And this, I think, is a very, very good example of that. We're very happy to be involved in this. The Africa program itself has been following, of course, the Sudan situation for a very long time, very closely. This is something that concerns us immensely. And the issues that we're looking at today of risk and resilience, and particularly focused through the Feinstein International Center at Tufts on Kordofan and Darfur areas of Sudan, is of great interest to us. I've asked today a good friend of mine, Alan Gulti, to be our moderator and take over for me here. Alan co-chairs our Sudan working group. He's also a global fellow for the Woodrow Wilson Center. Most famously, he's a former ambassador to Sudan and Tunisia and a former special envoy to Darfur for the United Kingdom. You will know that right away when you hear his accent. He's going to also begin by introducing all of the panelists for you to be aware of who they are and introduce their order of speaking. So with no further ado, Alan, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Steve. I didn't get where I am today by not knowing how to delegate. And the task that Steve has just assigned me, I'm going to delegate to Professor Helen Young, who is the Research Director of the Feinstein Institute and leader of this particular team. So Helen, if you'd introduce your colleagues and set the scene briefly.
Thanks very much, Alan. And I'd like to start by thanking the Woodrow Wilson Center, the World Wildlife Fund, and the American University who are hosting us today. We're very grateful for these opportunities to meet with a wide range of stakeholders. And I should say that this particular event is part of a series of dissemination events of the research studies and other work that we've been involved in. So today we're going to be presenting on 4 very specific research studies, and these fall under our work with the UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, Sudan Integrated Environment Project. And this is a 3-year project on livelihoods and environment. And Tufts is specifically focusing on 2 components in relation to livelihoods. One is markets and trade, and that work is led by our senior advisor, Margie Buchanan-Smith. And the second component is on pastoralism. Now, we have two research studies on each of those. So we'll first of all be hearing from Margie and also her partner, Yusuf El Toib En Noor, who is the executive director of the Darfur Development and Reconstruction Agency, a national NGO in Darfur. That will be followed by a presentation from my colleague Severio Cratley, who is the editor of the journal Nomadic Peoples, and who's been working with us on the pastoralism project for the last couple of years. And he's going to be presenting on this study, Standing Wealth. And we'll have a third presentation by Professor Hussein Suleiman, who is the director of the Department of Remote Sensing at the University of Gadaref in Eastern Sudan, and he will be co-presenting with myself. And our final member is Abdul Hafiz Mohammed, who is a researcher with Tufts, who has been working on a wide range of our activities. I should stress that we don't only do research studies. These research studies are part of a wider set of activities. So, for example, in relation to pastoralism, that includes stakeholder surveys, policy briefing papers, so very specific policy reviews, programmatic reviews. So, for example, we've just done two reports on LEGS projects. LEGS is the Livestock Emergency Guidelines and Standards. So we've been looking at livelihoods projects that focus on livestock, which is obviously for pastoralists and farmers. And the last element is the adaptation of a pastoralism policy training course. Now, that doesn't sound very exciting, but it's actually one of the most important tools that we have to take the findings of this research and these reviews to a wider group of stakeholders within the country. So, for example, we only have 2 hours with you here today, but when we run these trainings, we have up to a week with different groups of stakeholders to review the findings of the work and allow them to go through a process of considering the implications for whatever policy problem or local issue they're addressing. And that, we find, is absolutely crucial for taking results to a wider group. We'll be saying more about our partners in each of the presentations. And with that, I think I'll hand back to Alan and we can get on with the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. We're planning, as you've just heard, 3 presentations. We'll delay, if we may, questions until after all those 3 have been completed. I just want to stress that the team are very keen to have your feedback and ideas. So please be thinking especially about the recommendations as we listen to the presentations, so that we can focus on ideas and suggestions and discussion of what might be done by way of follow-up, because these studies are very often take place not in a vacuum, in a real situation, but people do not follow up. For example, I suspect we're going to hear that a lot of the same ground that was covered by another DFID study by hunting surveys from 1972 to 74 in South Darfur, which was the first time I visited Darfur myself. And the fact that we now need another in-depth study covering the same ground and a lot more strongly suggests that the need is action rather than more research. But let's hear first about the research. I'm turning it over to Margie and Yusuf.
Okay. Thank you very much. And what I'm presenting is really work that we've been carrying out in Darfur over the last 3 years. The outline of what I'm going to cover is I'll talk a little bit about the importance of trade in Darfur and the reason that we're doing this monitoring of trade, about some overall constraints to trade, much more at the policy level, and then what we really set out to look at in these studies and in this work was the impact of conflict on trade in Darfur, both on the livestock trade, but also the cash crop trade. And even though we set out to look at the impact of conflict, we realized that we had to pay attention to government policy as well. Despite the difficulties in Darfur, we did identify some emerging economic opportunities, which I'll touch upon, and also opportunities for peace building on the back of trade relations. And then Yusuf El-Taib will present some of the policy and programming recommendations that are coming out of this work. So why is it important to understand trade, particularly in a protracted conflict crisis, where often the attention is rightly on people's immediate relief needs? But actually, when you have a conflict that's going on for a decade and more, it's incredibly important to understand that bigger picture and to understand what's happening in terms of the wider economy, particularly to inform any interventions to support livelihoods and to find ways of actually supporting the economy in the longer term. So we often talk about trade being the lifeblood of Darfur's economy and also of pretty much every single livelihood in Darfur. Trade is central to people's livelihoods. And that's both long-distance trade, which has been going on for centuries from Darfur, but also trade within Darfur. And it's an absolutely key point of connection between different livelihood groups and different ethnic groups. And it has, for, again, decades and centuries, been a very important factor in building those social ties. I should say something about the national significance of the livestock and cash crop economy in Darfur. So as anybody who works on Darfur knows, the data can be very problematic, but which is why I'm putting down estimates all over the place. But the estimates indicate that Darfur accounts for a quarter to a third of Sudan's livestock resources post-secession. It produces around one third of the national groundnut harvest, of which actually very little is exported nowadays, and probably around 30% of the gum arabic traded in Sudan. So it's very important to the national economy. So our work is, and the work that Tufts is doing in partnership with DARA is really twofold. So we're carrying out ongoing market monitoring, and this is led by DARA, the NGO that Yusuf is heading up. And they're now covering 36 markets in 3 Darfur states, North, West, and Central Darfur. And they are producing these quarterly bulletins, some of which are on the table outside. So do take a look at those. And the plan is eventually to be covering the whole of the Darfur region, but we've been doing it step by step. And Tufts is playing an advisory role to DARA in setting up and running the program. And then Tufts has complemented DARA's work by carrying out these periodic in-depth studies, so these one-off studies. As we're picking up some trends through DARA's ongoing market monitoring, the in-depth studies are an opportunity to go into these trade, in particular commodities, in more detail and really try and find out what's happening. So we produced this report on the hoof a year ago, which is about the livestock trade, and we're just about to publish the follow-up, which is on the cash crop trade, and next year we're very much hoping to carry out a study on the cereal trade in Darfur. The reason we think this work is so important is that actually you can understand a lot about the conflict dynamics by understanding trade dynamics. Who's trading with who? Where is it safe to trade? Which trading routes are traders using? I already mentioned the importance of trade to livelihoods. And even though there's many parts of the Darfur economy that have been contracting in the last decade of conflict, there are these pockets of economic growth. And we think it's very important to identify those to see, again, how people's livelihoods can be supported in those areas. And it also provides early warning through market monitoring. So some of the work that DARA has done has drawn attention to parts of Darfur where food security indicators have been really deteriorating and have actually triggered responses both by government and by WFP in terms of food distributions. So let me say something about the overall constraints to domestic and international trade in Sudan, and this really refers to the federal policy level. In terms of livestock, federal policy has tended to emphasize animal health rather than production and marketing. And in terms of the crop side, actually very little attention has been paid to agricultural policy or to livestock policy during the oil-rich years. There's evidence that that is changing, but in the agricultural sector, the rain-fed sector, which of course is the majority of Darfur's agricultural outputs, has actually had very, very little attention. And you see it in terms of the figures of how much money has been allocated to agricultural research and extension, for instance. In terms of international markets, Sudan's really lost its competitiveness in many of the crops and livestock, which it's been exporting for decades. Partly that's exchange rate related when the exchange rate was particularly strong. But also Sudan has really struggled to meet increasingly high international standards and increasingly strict regulations as trade regimes have become more globalized. So we're certainly seeing that in terms of livestock and meat, but also in terms of other cash crops. Groundnuts was one of Sudan's major exports in the 1960s. Now it represents less than 1% of the value of Sudan's cash crop exports. And lack of access to affordable credit is another kind of generic problem holding back trade. So, how has conflict impacted on the livestock trade? And this is where there's very high risks now associated with livestock trading as a direct result of the conflict. So, early on in the conflict, but it still continues, but early on in the conflict, there was very high looting of livestock. And in many ways, livestock became a liability. And actually, traders themselves had their livestock looted as they were moving herds from one market to another. A number of traders, particularly in the early years of the conflict, went bankrupt as a result of that. And others have chosen to switch to trade in less risky commodities, for example, groundnuts. We've seen a decline in the number of livestock traders, and our estimates are that the livestock trade, especially in the early years of the conflict, contracted by something like 40 to 50%. These are estimates because the official data is either non-existent or very hard to get hold of, and is often very unreliable when you do get hold of it. So this is very much based on a lot of interviews with large numbers of traders across Darfur as well as in Omdurman, which led us to this estimate of the contraction of trade of around about 40 to 50%. But traders also talk about the deteriorating quality of livestock coming to the market. And that seems to be partly a consequence of livestock no longer having access to grazing areas that they had access to before. And also some groups which took responsibility for fattening the livestock before they came to the market, often those livelihood groups are now displaced. So that part of the production or the value chain has kind of dropped out. But as we know, traders are extremely flexible and adaptive, and Darfur's traders, I think, have a reputation for their entrepreneurialism. And we're also seeing constantly shifting trading activity according to the conflict dynamics. So some of the markets that are in more insecure areas or more difficult access have really contracted, and others have expanded. And the camel trade in North Darfur is a good example of that, where Malit market, which used to be North Darfur's preeminent camel market, has actually very much declined. And Seraf Omra, which is where this photograph, it's probably some of you at the back can't see it, but anyway, where this photograph was taken, has now become very much the center of the camel trade in North Darfur. Another way in which traders kind of show their remarkable flexibility is in the trade routes that they're choosing. So almost all livestock are trekked on the hoof out of Darfur, whether it's to Omdurman, whether it's to Libya, to Egypt, wherever it might be. And one of the consequences of the conflict is traders having to take these indirect and much, much longer trade routes to move through more secure parts of Darfur. So one example is cattle being trekked from El Geneina in West Darfur to Omdurman. Pre-conflict, it took around 45 to 60 days. Now it can take up to 4 months as they have to go through much more, take much longer routes. Traders are also adapting the way that they're trekking, for example, reducing the number of animals moving in one herd to reduce risks. But all these adaptations have really increased the transport costs. And this slide, I'll tell you, some of you may not be able to see it very well, but basically this slide shows how the trading costs have increased by 900% over the last decade. Between 2002 and 2011, the costs of trekking cattle on the hoof had increased by 900%. And 50% of the trekking costs now are the costs of paying for armed guards to accompany those herds, and also paying what we've called informal taxes, but basically paying the fees at all these informal checkpoints along the way, which is your best chance of guaranteeing safe passage. But the other thing that's worth mentioning is soaring formal taxes, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because that's been another feature of the last decade, is the extent to which formal taxes on trade have really escalated. Moving on to the cash crop trade, we particularly looked at groundnuts, as that's Darfur's #1 cash crop. But we also looked at sesame, gum arabic, tombak, which is chewing tobacco. For those of you who know, familiar with Sudan will be aware of that, and oranges, which are grown in the Jabal Mara area. From all the data that we could gather and talking to farmers and traders, we estimate that production for many of these cash crops fell by around 40 to 50% in the early years of the conflict. There seems to have been some recovery in recent years, particularly in groundnut production, but not to pre-conflict levels. And interestingly, some cash crops appear to be more conflict sensitive than others. So sesame is particularly conflict insensitive. With sesame, when it reaches maturity, you have to harvest it pretty much within a week. Otherwise, you lose the harvest. And if you don't have access to your fields during that critical period, you lose the harvest. Whereas cash crops like groundnuts and tombak, tombak is not palatable to livestock. So in that sense, it's more conflict sensitive in an environment where relations have often broken down between farmers and pastoralists, and therefore the arrangements about when livestock are going to access the fields have often broken down. And groundnuts, the leaves may be grazed by livestock, but the harvest of the nuts under the ground is still assured. Other things to mention is the declining volume of trade. So the graph, which again, I'm afraid it may be slightly hard to see, but the graph shows the quantity of unshelled groundnuts taxed in Niala, which shows how rapidly that dropped off in 2003, 2004, and only very minor recovery in the last couple of years. And again, deteriorating quality. So a lot of groundnut traders and farmers are reverting back to old practices of shelling the groundnuts by hand in the rural areas to try and reduce the transport costs. And actually what that means is a lot of the groundnuts are becoming contaminated by soil, stones, silica, and that's quite a problem when the groundnuts are then being processed through the milling plants. And also the use of plastic sacks is a major problem for causing high aflatoxin levels. So I'm just going to pick up some common trends during a decade of conflict that affect both the livestock and the cash crop trade. So the whoops, I think I might have lost some common trends. So first of all, the impact of urbanization with these changing settlement patterns in Darfur. There's very, very large urban population now triggered by displacement, as well as by those who have a choice about where they live, choosing to live in the towns. And there's really been a shift from the long distance trade for which Darfur has been famous for, as I say, decades and even centuries, to trade meeting the demands within Darfur's urban areas. So we're seeing this, for example, with the sheep trade. We're also seeing this with trade in groundnuts and groundnut oil. It's not to say there is no long-distance trade. That's still very much a part of Darfur's economy, but that's become less important, and trade seems to have reorientated to meeting the demands of the growing urban population. High levels of taxation, we've seen taxes going up 500, 600, 700%. And that's often as state government and locality authorities are under pressure to raise revenues from a contracting economy and as they're getting reduced resource flows from federal government. Deteriorating quality I mentioned, yet there are some economic opportunities associated with Darfur's shifting settlement pattern. And I'm going to highlight a couple of these. In terms of groundnuts, we're seeing a burgeoning dairy industry around many of Darfur's towns. And actually, this has received very little attention, I think, but is an area of growth. And also, livestock are often being zero grazed around the towns because it's too risky to take them out into the rural areas. But one of the consequences is a growing market or growing demand for livestock fodder. So that's pushed the price up for groundnut cake, groundnut leaves, and even groundnut shells, which had pretty much no market value before the conflict, have now got a market value, being used for poultry feed, for example. Another economic opportunity very much related to this shifting settlement pattern is an emerging meat industry within Darfur. So you've got some livestock producers now becoming meat consumers as they've become displaced. And really interestingly, the price of meat, which before pre-conflict was well below the price of meat in Khartoum, the price of meat in Darfur's towns is often hitting very similar levels to the price of meat in Khartoum, which before the conflict would have been unthinkable. But Darfur only has one abattoir, which is functioning very intermittently and very inefficiently. Interestingly, we also discovered through the livestock trade study a growing trade in hides and skins in the last few years, especially to West Africa. And there seems to be some very interesting links here to particularly to the AMIS peacekeeping troops, which seem to have played some role in facilitating this trade. But anyway, it's the rapidly rising prices is one indicator of how this has become another area of economic growth. Let me say something very briefly about building bridges through trade, and then I'll pass over to Yusuf, who will pick up on some of the recommendations coming out of this work. In both the livestock trade study and the cash crop study, we found examples of trade agreements being made between groups that were otherwise hostile to each other in the current conflict. Some very interesting examples related to the camel trade. So in order to keep that camel trade, long-distance camel trade going from North Darfur to Libya and to Egypt, we've seen some Arab groups and some Zagawa groups making agreements to move the camels through each other's territory safely in order to reach Libya. So some very interesting examples here of trade agreements being made. And another one is the orange trade. So somewhat surprisingly, given that oranges are produced in Jebel Mara, much of which is held by rebel movements, those oranges are being traded in Darfur's towns and even in Omdurman. And those oranges are having to move across conflict lines. But again, there's some very interesting examples of trade agreements that have been forged to keep that trade going. And we can talk more about that in the discussions. But it does indicate that there are some opportunities for peace building, although they need to be very, very sensitively addressed. But let me pass on to Yusuf now on the recommendations.
Before Yusuf takes over, I'm reminded that the use of cell phones in this room interferes with the transmission. So I must ask everybody, please, to switch off their cell phones. Not on vibrate or whatever, but off, please. Fadal Said Yusuf.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. In the interest of time, I go straight into the recommendations. And one of the recommendations is that we need to review the impact of taxation on trade and invest revenues obtained into market infrastructure. There is currently a very poor market infrastructure in Darfur. We also we need to unify, or there need to be unification of exchange rate. Currently, government gives different exchange rates to different traders. For example, gold prospectus are given different exchange rate than the livestock or gum Arabic or whatever traders. Making credit available and accessible to people, which is currently quite constrained and less available. And we also need to create a conducive environment, policy environment, in order to help traders do their work. And the example is that gum Arabic in Sudan was recently privatized, and that invited a wider involvement of traders in this and helped do the trade well. A recommendation that is Darfur specific is that we need to see an improved transportation and market infrastructure. As we say, the infrastructure in Darfur, even prior to the conflict, was quite down and weak, and that the conflict has actually affected the infrastructure available. Next, please. Recommendations that are livestock related, we need to formulate strategies to develop, to meet the meat industry in Darfur, to look at developing Darfur's abattoir capacity. Maggie has just said there is only one non-functioning. We need to improve the coal storage, and we need to look at the developing processes facilities for the meat byproducts, and we also need to ensure a small-scale livestock producer benefit as well as large-scale producers. A producer actually benefits less at the production end, less than the final seller. We also see an importance in feasibility study for expanding the leather industry, and the information was that Darfur owns nearly quarter of the livestock population in Sudan, hence a lot of potential leather work. We also see an importance in improved market infrastructure, as was just said, especially in more secure and thriving livestock markets. There were livestock markets in the past, but because of conflict, they lost their opportunity to hosting livestock as markets to new other markets. And these new other markets, they have less infrastructure, so that we need to see support to those areas. Recommendations related to cash crop. A greater attention needs to be paid to production end of the value chain, especially for groundnuts. Research and extension are highly needed. Possibilities need to be explored to establish a strategic reserve for groundnuts. Sudan, some years, produce a lot of groundnuts, and therefore a lot of import interest is there. But the following year, they lose that. We also need to look at a nationwide campaign to reduce aflatoxin of the produced groundnuts, and also we need to look at improved packaging of groundnuts and cash crops produced, and we also need to look at training support to the new agro-processors for groundnut. This is like when the old system broke down, new agro-processing facilities have come in, and we need to train people on the use of those new cropping up machines. I think you will find a lot more information about this on the web link shown here. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Yusuf, especially for being so concise and punchy. Good example for Saverio, who's up next.
Thank you very much. I think I might need the...
the little...
Also to have it on...
I take the opportunity of this readjustment to say that the shy violets at the back, if you're really finding difficulty in seeing the screen, there are plenty of seats further forward with an excellent view. So please, don't be shy. Come and see. Sabira.
Thank you very much. This was the first study on a group of two, specifically focusing on pastoralism, livelihoods, and production strategies. So as the first study, this one tried to create the conceptual framework, which would have been useful for the second study to operate. I will talk about the background to the study, and then I will give some information on the methodology and highlights on the findings and recommendations. Argentinian writer called Luis Borges once wrote a tale of an author who, in 1938, rewrites the Don Quixote, Cervantes' famous book. And because it was rewritten in 1938, his point was that it was a completely different book, being written in a different context. And somehow, the situation with pastoralism is similar in the sense that the conceptual context within which we now work on pastoralism has changed very radically over the last 15, 20 years. And this fundamental change has led us to consider the drylands, the rangelands, from a very different perspective, as an asset as opposed to as a problem, and to look at pastoral production systems as a way of exploiting this asset, as opposed to simply a coping strategy to deal with a hostile environment. So why do we work on pastoralism for this study? Well, obviously, Sudan's economy has changed fairly radically with the separation from the south, and it is expected to have to be much more reliant on agriculture over the next years. And as it happens, pastoralism is the main force of Sudan's agricultural production. Although we don't know much about it, there is a general belief that it represents roughly 90% of livestock production, but there are no data or hard evidence. So we are facing a situation in which the history of data collection is inadequate to deal with the present situation. Now, here are some of the literature that has led to the fundamental changes in the perspective on pastoral systems. You might be familiar with most of it. And the main feature of this change is that we now understand pastoralism as being able to exploit precisely the characteristic unpredictable variability of the rangelands, or the drylands, where we don't have a fragility of environment, we don't have scarcity of resources, but we simply have resources that become available in unpredictable and short-lived concentrations, but they do become available. And whether they are characterized by scarcity or not depends on the production strategy that you use. It's not inherent to the environment. And of course, a very particular feature of this way of exploiting unpredictable concentrations has to do with timing. If you reach the pasture at the right time, you can get the most of the nutrients that it is produced over the life cycle of the plant. If you arrive a little bit early or a little bit later, you don't get the same from the same grass. Because, of course, nutrients accumulate in the plant, and then they're used by the plant after a certain point to grow further. So timing is absolutely crucial, and timing has to do with moving, of course. To be able to arrive at the right time has to do with to be able to move and reach the pasture at the right time. So timing is absolutely crucial, and we have a problem because most interventions and methodologies embed assumptions about uniformity and stability, and so they're not very much fit to operate in conditions in which time-related differences are crucial. So if there is a lesson from pastoralism, the lesson is that with environmental variability, where environmental variability is the rule and not the exception in the environment, a food production system can do better by working with variability as opposed to against it, as it is the European or Western tradition of globalized agricultural production, by changing variability, limiting it, neutralizing it artificially if needed. Now, this perspective has been increasingly recognized also in policy contexts. This is one example, 2011, the policy framework, the first policy framework on pastoralism by the African Union, where the importance of mobility and the importance of pastoralism for African economies is stated very clearly. And next year, the first policy framework for dryland areas, arid and semi-arid areas in Kenya. And just this year, a couple of declarations, one from a large meeting of about 16 countries in Chad, and another one even more recent in Mauritania, stating the same principles. So if we have to synthesize a couple of important points of this big contextual shift, one would be that these days is becoming impossible or inadequate to assume that there is a perfect overlapping between pastoralism as a, hang on a sec. Okay, sorry, I have to operate to one. Between pastoralism as a cultural identity and pastoralism as a production system. If in the 50s this could be taken for granted, it is not the same anymore. So there are many pastoralists who recognize themselves as pastoralists, as a cultural identity, and who are not practicing pastoralism anymore. And at the same time, there are actually people who practice pastoralism, use pastoral production strategies, and are not necessarily identifying themselves with the pastoral identity, as we will see. So to be able to make this distinction is crucial. Otherwise, we run into big confusions. The second point that I want to make is that we are operating with a context, with a legacy of pastoral development interventions, which for about 60, sometimes for 100 years, have been undermining pastoral production systems, promoting sedentarization policies in various ways, from service delivery to actively trying to sedentarize pastoral populations, and therefore getting in the way of those fundamental strategies that allow them to make the best of the environment they work with. And so when we hit on problems concerning rangelands and pastoral development, we have to be able to distinguish whether these problems are inherent to the pastoral production system, or they are rather generated by the fact that people cannot use the strategies that are characteristic of the pastoral production systems. Unless we are able to make this distinction, again, we run into confusion. A brief highlight on the methodology. We operated with with 4 teams of 3 researchers who, for about 2 weeks, ran a long exercise in livelihood analysis in 4 locations in North Kordofan. And we also had interviews and surveys on markets. And we looked at the 3 production systems that are characteristic of pastoral production or livestock production in Sudan, so cattle, sheep, and camels, and tried to differentiate by level of wealth and by gender. Here's a map with the locations where we worked. And as a characteristic of the approach, we try to take into consideration this big shift at the conceptual level, and therefore took a fresh look at the work we were doing, and kept in mind that the shift at the theoretical level will entail a renegotiation of qualitative assumptions embedded in quantitative analysis. By this, what do I mean? Well, in order to count anything, you have to have made decisions about what you're counting. Not just what, in the sense that we are counting pastoralists rather than farmers, but also what are pastoralists. No? You have to make decisions concerning the definition of the entities that you are counting. And these decisions are usually taken for granted in quantitative analysis. It's not something that is redone every time, and that makes sense, otherwise you waste a lot of time. But when you shift from one context to another, then the assumptions that you have made for the first context cannot be transferred to the next one. So you have to renegotiate them. And now we have realized that we are shifting to a different context. So there is a need to renegotiate qualitative assumptions. And I will give an example of what I mean in this regard. Another approach we took was to not simply accept that we don't have enough data or good enough data on pastoralists, but try to see what kind of information we have and at least try to delimit the uncertainty that we have with regard to the data on pastoral production systems. And in many cases, we were able to combine information from the field. We worked with professional traders as part of our team who had a sort of inside information on, for example, the maximum number of sheep that can be carried on a lorry, or the maximum number of people who will be part of the crew that transport these animals, and so on. And by piecing together all these fragments of information, we try to generate what I call at least values, meaning that they are robust downwards, but they're most likely incorrect upwards. So they are likely to be much higher, but they are unlikely to be shorter, smaller. Okay, one of the first results we had by taking this approach has been realizing that most of the mechanisms for appraisal, economic appraisal in Sudan are focusing on exports. And by recalculating some of the values produced in a recent IGAD report on the total economic valuation of livestock in Sudan, we were able to identify that about 2% only of the total production in livestock in Sudan is exports. So if we have all the survey mechanisms focusing on exports, that means that we are actually ignoring about 98% of the economy related to livestock, with consequences that you can imagine. This is a table. I don't have time to go through it in details, but you find it in the report. Is a table trying to show some of these at least values that we have been able to produce. And one of them, in this case, the example I'm going to give, is the number of jobs that we have identified, the minimum number of jobs we have identified as sustained by pastoral production, but beyond primary production, so along the value chain. So these are not producers, these are people who are living out of the existence of pastoral production. 40,000 full-time jobs, meaning that there are probably 400,000 people behind them, estimating about 10 dependents for every job, behind every job. And also, in most cases, these jobs are not actually full-time, so the number of people who are getting some sort of support from these jobs is likely to be even higher. A second example is the scale of business related to feedlotting in Omdurman. Actually, the feedlotting operation in Omdurman are very interesting, also for another reason, because about 240,000 cattle every year arrive to Omdurman, and most of them end up in feedlotting operations. And of course, the way livestock is monitored focuses on last transaction. So you could be quite surprised by seeing that most of the cattle in Sudan appear to be produced in Khartoum, because the last transaction are from the feedlot operations. Of course, these are cattle that come from the greater region of Darfur and Kordofan, and are recorded as produced in Khartoum because of this region. Anyway, 18 million of US dollars only in feed to run the feedlot operations, so only to buy the feed. With regard to the actual production strategy, the main finding we ran into is that, of course, we knew before, in a way, we knew from the theory that mobility is crucial. But what we found out is that it is crucial not only for those who are supposed to be mobile, but also for those who are supposed to be sedentary. So the sedentary producers who are either described as sedentary by the administration or who describe themselves as sedentary when you talk to them, if you ask, they will tell you that they move the livestock for about 9 months per year, using roughly the same strategy that pastoralists would use, that is exploiting short leaf concentration of nutrients on the range. So mobility is something that has to do with the way of using effectively the dryland environment, and does not only concern people who are described as nomads. It concerns also most of the pastoral production or livestock production in the country, and as we will see through connections with different production systems through buying crop residues, for example, or water. It also concerns other production, other systems of production in the country. Can we move to the next one? Yep, thanks. One example is the livestock trade. Livestock traders are not usually considered part of primary production, but in fact, to the extent to which they move livestock on the hoof, they are actually producing, because they exploit the pasture that they encounter along the way in a deliberately slow journey during the wet season, journey that could take a couple of weeks, but take maybe 45 days or more, and it takes longer because they go deliberately slow in order to exploit the pasture. So they are using a pastoral production strategy at all the effects. In many cases, mobility has been distorted or limited. People who cannot go in transhumance to South Kordofan are forced to stay in the north and keep their animals during the dry season in the north. This does not mean that they don't move anymore. In fact, they appear to move even more than before, if for shorter distances, but more intensively. So we must be able to distinguish and to understand why mobility is done in a certain way. Resilience increases with ties of cooperation and complementarity, meaning that the encounter, the seasonal encounter between pastoral producers and, say, crop farmers, by buying crop residues, for example, combines these two systems and increases the resilience of both. And something that is very important to understand with regard to resilience is that, as opposed to crop farming, pastoral production is not scalable down to zero. With crop farming, you can decrease the size of the land you're farming. And of course, at some point, you won't be able to feed your family anymore. But the strategy that you're using are roughly the same. With pastoral production, you can't not do that. When you go below a certain threshold of number of livestock you have, you cannot use pastoral production strategies anymore. You have to be more sedentary, and you cannot afford to keep your animals mobile. So you have two chances at that point. You either don't do it, or you give your animals to somebody who can do it. And this is what happens when things go well. No? Within the pastoral system, small producers try to entrust their animals to larger producers who may be their relatives, and by doing that, they are able to keep small numbers of livestock who could not be as such able to enjoy the higher returns given by pastoral production. They are able to keep them at that level of higher returns. So it's absolutely crucial to maintain these links. This happens by entrusting livestock, sometimes happens by selling labor. So you go and work as a wage herder for a larger producer and take your animals with you. And of course, between livestock and livestock production and crop farming, we usually understand cropping livestock integration only at the level of the farm, and this again is a result of a Western perspective. In the drylands, we have a different situation. The left hand of the screen shows the situation we are more familiar with, which is the European tradition. But in dryland environments, we find crop livestock integration at a large scale, at the regional scale, and not necessarily all the time, only in certain seasons. So it's a completely different approach to crop livestock integration, which is still very much in the process of being understood. first recommendation that follows from this general context is that we have to secure the conditions of livestock mobility according to the logic of pastoral system. So we have to secure timely access to pasture. And this is crucial not only for pastoral producers, but is also crucial to increase the resilience of crop farming, because without mobility, there is no common language between the two systems. And in order to do that, we have to be able to understand, to distinguish between distortions and strategies that actually belong to the pastoral production system. And we have to engage with the existing systems of production rather than assuming that the only way to go is to replace them. So understanding and strengthening, at least not undermining the interlinkages between categories of producers and across production systems becomes crucial. One of the problems we have is that most of the approaches focus on household. And of course, if you have a household focus, you will not be able to capture what really matters in this context, which is the relationships between households. No? So you have to take a wider scale perspective. And without the wider scale perspective, you don't capture the large scale integration between production systems either. So scale, timing are very, very crucial. And finally, one word about the issue of modernization that keeps popping out every corner, but it's still very much from an old model perspective. Modernization, okay, I try to give a synthesis here. You can see it this way. Again, on the left hand of the screen is roughly the situation we found in the European tradition, where the basis of production is temperate environments. And you can see the strategy has been working against unpredictable variability and trying to exploit uniformity and stability. As a consequence, the possibilities offered by science and modern technology has been to increase this capacity, increase the strategy of exploiting uniformity and stability. On the other hand, on the left hand of the screen, we have dryland environments where the fundamental strategy has been working with unpredictability instead of against it. The error has been that we have assumed that there was no difference between these two bases of production. But by doing so, the strategy that has been used in dryland environments has been invisible or ignored or found to be a mistake. And as a consequence, the only way we have understood modernization has been to transfer the solutions that we already had developed for the temperate environments, transfer it simply to the dryland environments, no? Off the shelf, second hand. Now we understand that there is a fundamental difference, and therefore we don't really know what the modernization of pastoral systems would be. The work has to be done, basically. For 60 years, we have been talking about modernizing pastoral systems, but what we actually have done has been to suggest solutions that were meant to replace them with something else. So we have to do the work of using the possibilities offered by new technologies and modern science to actually develop and improve these strategies used by production systems that are native in an IT sense, not in an anthropological sense, no? Native to the environment of dryland and environmental instability. So in a way, we have to acknowledge that we have to use a different language. This is metaphor, but is a different world, and it requires a new work for modernization that hasn't been done yet. So there's a whole horizon open, and we hope very much that people will take up the challenge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Helen.
Thank you. So I'm going to be making the final presentation with Hussein on on the second pastoralism study that we've done in Sudan. The title of the report is Pastoralism in Practice, Livestock Mobility in Contemporary Sudan. And this work very much builds on the earlier presentation on the earlier study by Severio, particularly in terms of the the theoretical framework, but also building on this finding that highlighted the importance of livestock mobility for all producers. I will present the background and aims and methods. We will go over to Hussein for the key findings, and I'll conclude with conclusions and recommendations. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that this work is very much a result of a partnership, which applies to all of the activities. In particular, our national partners, we have 2 government partners, including the federal and state level ministries of animal resources, fisheries and range, and 3 national NGO partners, DARA, Darfur Development and Reconstruction Agency, SOS Sahel Sudan, and El Massar Organization for the Development of Nomads, 3 national NGOs. We also have a network of national academics that we work with throughout the country, for example, Hussein, but also international organizations. And obviously, we're working under the UNEP umbrella. This partnership very much fosters demand-driven research and ensures that we have stakeholder engagement at all levels. So why this study now? Essentially, the motivation for the study is the lack of evidence for informing current policy and practice. And so I just want to reflect on some of the pressing policy issues of the time. In recent years, particularly since succession, there has been an increasing profile importance of livestock, and particularly in terms of, as it was mentioned, the contribution to exports, but more broadly to the national economy and the role of livestock as the mainstay of local livelihoods. And the reason for this is in part because of the issues of falling oil revenues post-succession and the search for something to fill that gap. But also, the other reason it's received attention is because of the challenges of cross-border mobility for the northern pastoralist groups who cross into South Sudan and can spend upwards of 5 months during the dry season. And the third pressing issue relates to conflict, particularly the issue of natural resource conflict, which is widely acknowledged as a major issue, obviously linked with livelihoods, but also linked with the multiple levels of conflict that are playing out. Now, the policy response, the national policy response to these new economic and political realities has been very mixed. While the importance of livestock is recognized, the focus is on animals, not people. And the national policy imperative is very much a modernizing drive that goes hand in hand with the settlement of pastoralists. So sedentarization is seen as part of modernization of the sector. And as we have heard, that is actually counter to the production system. And that context is essentially the justification for the work. Now, I don't think I need to explain that conducting field-based social science research in Sudan is extremely difficult at the best of times, and especially challenging when the population of interest are pastoralists. As we've heard, there's a problem with defining who we're actually talking about when we mention pastoralists. They're obviously hard to reach, they're on the move, and in some seasons spread out over a very vast area. Now, in a context of protracted insecurity and conflict, we obviously have issues for our study population, but also for our researchers in terms of safety and access. And we're also facing the sometimes strained relationships between the national authorities and the international community, which affects all of us and obviously generates a high degree of suspicion and mistrust if you're going to be trying to engage in research. Now, the aims of this work as a result of those challenges were very much to design and test new methods to investigate pastoralist livestock mobility, and in order to monitor livestock movements, but also to look at how herds are managed in the context of Sudan and the factors that influence this. which we think very much relates to the resilience of the pastoralist livelihood system. And the intention is to improve policymakers and practitioners' understanding of the pastoralist system, the rationale underlying it, and also those externalities. Now, in recognition, I mean, I haven't said very much about the problems with existing methods. We decided that in order to properly capture this seasonal livestock mobility, we would have to look at it over time. So we designed new methods of longitudinal monitoring. And essentially what that did was combined GPS tracking of livestock herds, which provides a detailed account of actual movements, including distances covered, speed, time spent in specific localities or locales, complemented by details of herd management practices. For example, in relation to their weekly access to natural resources, the rain conditions, the use of supplements, livestock health expenditure, etc. And we also used more classic methods of looking at last year's movements based on herder recall. We had weekly phone interviews and regular outreach visits, which were more qualitative. I'm not going to say too much about the methods, and if you want to know more, please ask during the questions. I'm now going to hand over to Hussein to give you some of the findings.
Thank you, Helen. I will start by giving some highlighting on the study area. Our field survey had concentrated only in the Kordofan and East Darfur state. And within these two states, we are tackling the issue of cattle herders in Darfur and also sheep herders, somehow central Kordofan, and a little bit to the north, the camel herders of that part of the country. To understand how the seasonal movement of herders are impacted by different factors, but I think understanding vegetation dynamic is very important. For example, during April, a significant part of herders take the decision to migrate to South Sudan. And to do so, they have their own way to engage with local leaders and to sign some local agreements in many cases. We see like this, and when it is established and real greening, they return back to the country and proceed to the north, maybe even entering the Goz area and the real Sahel part of the country, especially for sheep and cattle herders. We know that one of the factors that impacting their movement is their herd composition and herd size. And for different factors, although they try to identify themselves as camel herders or sheep herders or cattle, they try to make mixed herd so as to distribute some of the risk or different economical factors so as to cope with the new situation in the country or in the region in general. Also, this is the case in North Kordofan, that they try to breed more than one species, so to access for different, to utilize the environment in a better way. Now we would like just to give a general overview of their movement from south to north, migrating along the corridors, but they have different strategy to do so. And for conflict reason, sometimes they try to avoid sensitive area and to stay in different places. And that has created a different situation and maybe conflict with local farmers in the area because it is not their traditional migrating routes. And this is the case happened this year when erupted the conflict between Maalia and Rizegat in East Darfur, which is still continuing till now. Also, using GPS tracking, we can have more understanding about their day-by-day movement, also seasonal movement. And this herder, he decided to go to the north by the starting of the rainy season and spending some weeks in the north and later return back again because he discovered the information he collected about the greening, all this information are not true. He returned back again to spend more time in the south and proceed once again to the north after the establishment of the rainy season. And they're the real greening that attract him to find the chance to graze fresh vegetation. Another example is the case of another cattle herder from East Darfur. In his way to the north, also he faced by some problems, and the traditional routes was blocked totally, and he stayed for some weeks in the north, and after that he decided to return back from here, to return back a little bit to spend some weeks, and where he is staying during mid of August, there is some farmers and different other community, different settled people, so that he signed local agreements, and he spent most of his time in this part of the landscape. This is example from a real Sahel part of the study area in North Kordofan, sheep herder. Using this GPS technology, he tried to we can trace him that he rapidly changed his camping places due to the scattered vegetation condition in that part of the country. Also, we can trace his movement to watering points, how long it takes him to reach the water point, and how many hours he will stay at that place, and when he return back, which type of movement he is like to take. And I think we can utilize such information for surface distribution, including water points. I think I will handle again to Helen. She will go on with the conclusions.
I should emphasize that we are just trying to give you a flavor or a taste of some of this data that we've collected and some of the implications. Obviously, the report is far richer because we are covering a group of herders in both East Darfur and North Kordofan. And through the qualitative outreach visits and the weekly questionnaires, we're also finding out about systems of natural resource governance and, of course, those wide array of factors that are influencing those movements that Hussein touched on. For the conclusions, I'm going to finish by talking about a few of the key areas that we touched on. And in so doing, I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the findings as well. So essentially, because one of the main aims was actually to develop these new approaches, we look at the implications of those for research, learning, and promoting policy debate. The fact that we have been able to use this GPS technology in Sudan, in Darfur, in areas adjacent to the border, I think has a lot of lessons learned for the nature of those partnerships that we've developed. Particularly given that it's with a ministry whose number one policy is the settlement of pastoralists. And I think this highlights some of the contradictions that you see when you're working in Sudan. And perhaps we can come back to that in the discussion. So these partnerships were multi-stakeholder, multi-level, multidisciplinary. We've seen over the past 2 years the development of national networks, including independently of our work, a pastoralism forum that is taking forward these issues, and it's very much stimulated debate. What we'd just like to stress is that in the recommendations is we'd like to see the door kept open to such pioneering approaches. When we started this work, we couldn't tell our donor, UKA Department for International Development, that we want to go out and do longitudinal GPS mapping of these communities. This grew out of this earlier work. And that kind of flexibility and long-term engagement is actually crucial to this type of work, because it's actually very unpredictable what you're able to do in Sudan. So we have to work with those constraints. So the principles that we're adhering to are things like fostering demand-driven research, fostering stakeholder networks, and such like. And I make that point because I think as researchers, we don't often have the sort of opportunity we've had in Sudan. And the second point is that we've contributed, we feel that the research has definitely contributed to increased understanding of the resilience of pastoralist production. We've looked at issues of sustainability from an environmental, economic, and a social perspective. And it is clear from the work that it is pull factors that are driving the pastoralist imperative to move. In other words, they are moving because of the attraction of better pasture and more favorable conditions. That is the underlying rationale for their movement. It's not push factors. And yet, on the other hand, we are seeing risks and hazards, such as the Rizigat-Malia conflict, that are actually push factors. But one, as Severio has pointed out, is inherent in the system. The other is a result of those externalities. In relation to that theoretical framework and paradigm, clearly a lot of current policies are based on misconceptions of pastoralism, and there is a need to realign policies and practice. And an example I quickly want to mention is the recent peace agreements on Darfur, the DPA and the DPPD. We have reviewed how they approach and perceive pastoralists, and they are very much in that former tradition of seeing pastoralism as a set of cultural values and traditions linked with a pastoralist identity. Pastoralism as a production system, as a livelihood system, is conspicuous in its absence. And so pastoralism, nomadism, is seen in relation to, for example, the situation of IDPs and access for humanitarians. And that perspective obviously risks undermining the productive part of pastoralism, whereas rain-fed agriculture is prioritized as a development priority. Also, we reflect on new trends and adaptations. Now, many of these can be seen as very positive in terms of modernization and development of pastoralism. So, for example, the use of mobile bladder tanks in North Kordofan that enables access to pasture. And this is very much a result of the privatization of provision of water. So this is, that's enabled, anyway, moving on. We've seen an expansion into sheep production in East Darfur. And perhaps the factor I want to touch on here is we've captured a number of conflict avoidance strategies, obviously changing routes, but also actual strategies that herders use in order to prevent conflict with farmers, which hitherto have not been well known or well established. We present new evidence about local systems of natural resource governance, and in particular, we highlight what we call a new pastoral parametric approach to local resource management. Now, this parametric approach has been described elsewhere in relation to fisheries, and basically it's concerned with regulating access to resources rather than regulating number of animals, so a complete shift from the carrying capacity approach. And we identify a number of examples of local governance, and we think that we can learn from these positive experiences and they can be used to influence national policy. Finally, I should mention that there is an entire chapter of the report that focuses on the political economy of livestock migration. That's where we look at the peace agreements, but we also look at the multiple roles and functions of land. Land is obviously a crucial issue underpinning all levels of conflict in the Darfur crisis, and so we cannot look at pastoralist mobility without taking on board the issue of land. And we examine its structural links with tribal politics, with political allegiances in relation to the conflict, and obviously power dynamics. And the conclusions that we draw there, particularly in relation to the polarization between tribal groups and the implications of that for livestock mobility, are really, really key. And we argue very strongly that we cannot look at natural resource conflict in isolation from these wider tribal dynamics and these wider higher level conflicts, where there is a tendency to focus in just on that farmer-herder dynamic while ignoring these wider links. Finally, just to acknowledge the absent team members, one of whom is actually Roy Benke, who was working with Hunting's Technical Services in 1985, who actually accessed this body of research that Alan referred to. And we've actually reproduced a lot of those materials, including graphs and figures, etc., because they are as relevant today as they were then. So I just wanted to close with that remark. Thank you.
Very good. We've got a little time for questions. Let me try and provoke the team a bit with a first one, which is to do with the effect of climate change and desertification on this whole sector. In effect, what I'm interested to know is whether the long-term prospects for the sector are so poor that all this research and even implementation of recommendations would only leave a much reduced productive capacity. If that is right, then the hope of using better prospects to impel people towards settling the various conflicts in the region, South Kordofan and Darfur, of course, North-South as well to some extent, are reduced. And one reason we found in the DPA negotiations and elsewhere that it was very difficult to persuade the armed groups that there was a future for them in peace was that they thought of that purely in terms of government jobs and not in terms of increased prosperity for their people. So the second question is whether you can present your findings and the prospects in such a way as to build stakeholders, if you like, on the sides of government at all levels in Sudan and on the armed groups to say that there's a better future ahead if we make peace.
Thank you. I think it would be quite helpful to have a couple of responses to those questions, maybe from a technical perspective on the climate change issue. Hussein, maybe you want to say something on that. But on this latter issue, I'd just like to reflect that, as I mentioned, a lot of our work is about strengthening stakeholders' understanding of the issues. We are researchers, we are academics, and we very much promote our academic identity in Sudan. So our work is not actually to do the advocacy, but it's to generate the evidence and the learning and to inform those bodies of stakeholders. Now, of course, as a US university, we are not perhaps best placed to do that. And that is why we have the national partners, the NGOs, and why for our training, we are building a national facilitation team. We've built one who are actually volunteers who are working in government, universities, and other professional domains. And it's their job to work with those stakeholders to help them work with our evidence and learning. So we have tried to establish a process to do that, and I think we're well on the way. But actually, it would be helpful if somebody would come and evaluate us. But do you want to say something about the climate change and the model, or Seraf?
Maybe under the rainfall, under the climate change condition and variability, I think pastoralism is one of the promising assets to think about that. And if we took Sudan as an example all over the country, even the irrigated part of agriculture, we see that on all these parts of the country, animal breeding has becoming one of the good options for them to distribute the risk of climate change over other options. And if we took myself, for example, the part of Jazeera and Gaddarif area, where there is a significant part of rain-fed agriculture, they are mainly using crop residue to feed their animals, and especially when there is failed crop, there is no good harvest. This is the other option for them to go for animal breeding. Because of that, we think that pastoralism and this sort of mobility, utilizing the landscape in different way and in different time, could be one of the good options for the country.
Actually, on a second thought, I might say something. the perception of climate change should be distinguished from the quantitative evaluation with, for example, in rainfalls, millimeters and so on. One thing which is very interesting is there is in global narratives, there is a recurrent theme about the increasing frequency of drought. You will find it in many policy documents, and it's a sort of taking for granted. That's it. There is increasing frequency of drought, especially perceived in pastoral areas. And this is half a truth, and half a truth only. No? What makes it half is that it is perceived in pastoral areas, but perception does not match with the figures on precipitation usually. What does that mean? That the pastoral groups in rangelands do experience a more frequent state of crisis. The fact is that this is largely led by the impossibility of applying their production strategies as they have developed them. So a legacy of sedentarization and difficulties in using pastoral production strategies means, as a matter of fact, that they are experiencing a situation in which pasture is not good enough. Drought. Drought from a pastoral perspective is lack of pasture, is not lack of rain. That has to be kept in mind. So one should be able to distinguish this again. If you talk to rangeland ecologists, they will say that actually the evidence from a climatic perspective is very weak. But if you talk to any pastoralists in the field, they will say, oh yes, it's increased frequency of drought. Because of course they see what they perceive. We should be able to make this distinction. Is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me throw the discussion open. Please wait for the microphone once you're recognized, and please state your name and affiliation. The lady on the right. We need a microphone here, please.
Is it on? Hi, Laura Arnson with USAID Food for Peace and adjunct with American University. Actually in peace research, so it's a very interesting combination. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was very interested in this idea of the information that is required for these strategies. And you were talking about the, within that strategy, knowing where and when is the optimal place and time. And that mobility seems heavily dependent on information. So my question was this. I know in Darfur with epidemiologist divisions, they do use cell phone technology to communicate any information about the reportable diseases. And I know that the epidemiologists across Darfur were moving ahead with that some years ago. So I imagine they're a little further along now. So my question was, is there cell phone technology or mobile communications technology used in the communication of information about when and where it's the most optimal to be with your herds? Or maybe that's a non-issue. Maybe there are other channels of that communication. And then if so, who kind of controls or holds that information? Or maybe it's not an issue. But I was wondering about that. Is it the herders? Is it the owners? Is it producers? Is it traders? And is that an issue or not? Because you hadn't mentioned that communication of that information or how they do acquire that. And I was curious about that. Thanks.
Let's try and take a bunch of questions together. There's a gentleman right at the back.
Yeah, my name is Mohammed, and I'm with the Enough Project. My question is around the application of science to this system of agriculture. Usually, when people talk about applying science and technology, usually that school of thinking is narrowed to the optimization of food production, and we see the application of fertilizers and GMOs in some areas. How much, with oftentimes serious environmental and cultural consequences, how much, if that's what you were thinking, how much would cost and environmental and cultural sensitivity, play a factor in that scientific approach to pastoral farming in this region? Thank you.
Let's take a last question from Mr. Freeman here.
Thank you. Lawrence Freeman, EIR Africa Desk. When I was in Darfur camps in Al Fashir, then the head of UNIMED, Gambari, was telling me there was a movement out of the camps into trying to get back into the areas of livelihood for people outside of the IDP camps. Is this process here, I mean, pastoralization, is this an actual now occupation that more people are moving out of the camps, that people can rely on their own in some effective way? There's also a great lake under this entire area, huge lake of water that's been documented. Is there any attempts to use this water to actually increase the production? And is Khartoum, now that they having severe economic problems, is the government actually putting any effort in fostering, helping, assisting in the development of farming or pasteurization as a new means of increasing the productivity of their economy?
Good. Who'd like a first crack at that?
I think the first question was largely to me, so maybe
Cell
I
phone
start.
technology? Come on then.
Information on mobility. I'm actually very glad that somebody asked this question. Thank you very much. Because the introduction of cell phone technology in pastoral areas has really opened up a whole new horizon of possibilities and has changed in a deepest possible way the condition of being mobile in relation to administration services and so on, and potentially it will be the key to a new way of dealing with mobile production. They are using mobile phones, of course. It has spread like bushfire, but it has spread only where the coverage is provided. And indeed, I mentioned these two declarations in Chad and Mauritania this year, and both emphasize the importance of securing total coverage in the Sahel in this case, in so-called remote areas. So remoteness, of course, is directly resulting from lack of communication. So the minute you have complete coverage, the very notion of remoteness becomes much more relative. No? And in fact, these declarations are linking the importance of complete coverage not only to the effectiveness of the pastoral production, but also to the possibility of keeping a vibrant society, state-related society in these remote areas. So almost as a condition of security, very much so indeed. So for the moment, yes, mobile phones are used for sharing information on markets, not only on the quality of pasture. They could be used more. The best pasture happens to be in places where there is no network. Of course. No? So for the time being, I think there is a strong reliance on still on word of mouth, largely through connections at the markets or the water points, as it has always been. Pastoralism operates with a large network of shared intelligence, which is another reason why focusing on household is not really sufficient. Is not something that you can do only based on household at the household level. Breeding is the same. You breed at level of clan usually, maybe 50 herds. You share information on a very large social network. You are depending on a very large social network for safety nets, for moving on large distances during migration, or when mobility is indeed largely a push factor, which does happen in case of drought, for example, severe droughts. I mean, not dry season, of course. So, yes, technology is would be key in this sense. I spoke to a manager of a telephone company in Chad only a few months ago, and they were saying they were developing medical health services by phone in Chad for rural areas, not pastoral areas yet, because they're not covered. But so the opening, the possibilities is huge. With the introduction of tablets, cheap tablets, you could do education, you could do animal health services. Obviously, it's not as good as you would have it if the veterinarian was there, but as it's not there.
Good. Helen.
Just following on from that about the technology, the fact that our study was based on weekly interviews by mobile phone, I think gives you an indication of the spread of the technology. And of course, that also tells us, we also know there are some areas, of course, particularly when our pastoralists went into the south or go further south, when they're out of contact. And also when that tribal conflict erupted on the 9th of August, at that period, they were out of contact. So we do have periods when they go in and out of contact. And also we found that, for example, in North Kordofan, that the herders will often notify us when they know they're going to be out of contact or if they can't make a particular appointment to talk or whatever. I want to just take the question about the lake. This is where I wish I had my UNEP colleagues watching or with us to be able to respond, because this is not my area. But my understanding is that the discovery of this ancient lake, which was actually ancient in the sense that it existed millennia ago, which I believe was by a Professor Albaz from Boston, while that was very important evidence of a lake that existed millennia ago, there is no evidence to suggest it exists currently. And in fact, the benefits of modern technology, I was able to search my database to see what I had, and I've got an article here, Darfur Lake is a mirage. And that's because it existed millennia ago, and I can give you this reference. But the other point that my colleagues in UNEP have pointed out to me, that the location of this lake is 500 kilometers north of El Fasher. So even if water was discovered there, whether or not it would be feasible to transport it to be useful anywhere is very questionable. I didn't quite understand the question. Mohammed, I do apologize. I didn't quite understand your question, but one of the points, what it triggered the comment that we have to understand livestock production in Darfur, as in all of Sudan, is not only by pastoralists and nomads. And what was really coming out very strongly in this study in North Kordofan is that all producers are practicing livestock mobility. So those IDPs who are returning and invest in livestock as a mainstay of their production system, they will be moving their animals. And the degree to which they move them is a function of their herd size. And we haven't said very much about it, but the notion, we also have to recognize that these livelihood systems, whether you're farming or producing livestock, the question of integration is absolutely crucial, because the same piece of land, the same area of land is used by multiple users throughout the year. I had that point in my presentation. So you have the rainy season cultivation of the main harvest, you have the post-harvest grazing of those residues or harvesting of those residues for resale. You have potentially winter cultivation of that same land, depending on fertility and access to water, which would be mostly horticulture. And then you probably have different livestock species grazing at different times of the year. So you have multiple users in the same area. And that makes for quite complex land tenure arrangements, which are obviously undermined by the notion of individual land tenure. So very complicated issues.
Good. Let's take a...
Can I just say a small thing
Of course.
on there?
Said Yusuf.
Shukran lak. Thank you very much. I'm slightly moved by the question about the lake in northern Darfur, and it's good that there was a lake like this, and that there is a potential source of water for use in a place structurally facing food insecurity and water problems in Darfur. But if we look at what runs off of water from Darfur into Chad or in other places at the moment, on the surface, run unused, we really think of whether it is good to think about the potential lake hidden somewhere 500 kilometers north of Al Fasher, or the probably close to 25% of the White Nile water income annually into Egypt. I think our problem in that part of the world is that we work across abundant resources that we make no use of them, let alone the ones that we really require a heavy investment of what we should look into.
Margie, you wanted a quick word.
Very quickly, again, picking up on a couple of the comments, application of science and technology. I actually wanted to point out that on the agricultural side, there's probably been far too little application of science and technology to boosting agricultural production in Darfur. And certainly looking at groundnuts, there's quite concerning evidence of declining productivity, not particularly over the last 10 years, over the last decade of the conflict, but even before that. And actually talking to farmers, Ministry of Agriculture officials, traders, I mean, they're really concerned that there should be much more location-specific research done on identifying appropriate varieties and on ways of boosting productivity. So that's actually where there's inadequate application of science and technology. And very quickly on the cell phone technology, absolutely critical to trade in the current context. It's how traders keep contact with truckers moving their produce around, but also traders are having to make arrangements all the time with groups in control of different areas, different geographical areas, in order to, again, secure safe passage. So just very briefly to say how critical it is.
Good. Let's have another round. A gentleman there, and then the lady there, and gentleman here.
Hello, Jess Wilhelm, recently returned Peace Corps volunteer from Southern Africa working with agropastoralists. I have a question about the intrinsic. You mentioned a lot of the external factors constraining pastoralist livelihoods. What are some of the intrinsic factors? Are we seeing any human-induced or livestock-induced degradation of pastures? What is the population of pastoralists and also of sedentary farmers who are keeping livestock? And is there a long-term process wherein the livelihood of pastoralism is going to face internal constraints from overstocking or underexploitation of resources because of crowding out, because of more cropping land or other factors? Thank you.
We had a lady here.
Thank you. I'm Nancy Hayden from the University of Maryland, and I'm doing a PhD dissertation on the long-term impacts of intervention and civil conflict with case studies in Africa. And you had talked just on one bullet in the slide about land, and it's a source of power. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more about land ownership and how the system of payment for land for safe passage, who does that money go to? Who else besides the pastoralists benefit directly from their from this livelihood? And then what are the impediments just from the perspective of land ownership, kind of, and where that trend in Sudan is going?
Thank you. The gentleman on the right.
Thank you. I'm Terry Wallen with the office. I'm a livestock advisor with the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance in USAID. Just a quick compliment to the Feinstein Center at Tufts because of the work you do. We use you a lot. We have funded some of your work, but we've also benefited a great deal from the studies you've done. My question has to do with natural resource management in the arid and semi-arid lands. We know that the livestock benefit from the landscapes in various seasons, but what can we do, or what is being done in terms of improving range lands using some of the new thinking on how to manage grasslands?
Thank you. And we have a last question here.
Thank you. I'm Rick Houghton from the American Friends of the Episcopal Church of Sudan. I'm interested in how your research gets passed back to Sudan. Are your papers translated into Arabic? Are they available in Darfur and Kordofan?
Good. Let's take some answers to that. Helen, I guess you can dispose of the last question very
Oh,
quickly.
yes, let me take that one. That's a nice, easy one. When we did our stakeholder survey, we actually did face-to-face interviews and online interviews, and we thought the online approach would capture some of the international community, but actually what it captured was all of those people who are working for government outside of Khartoum who are not normally consulted. So we had a database of more than 600 nationals all over the country, including South Sudan, who responded to our online survey. They became our database for disseminating reports, newsletters, etc. So that's one avenue. So, and that database of over the last 3 years we've built up so people join it. We also have a series of strategic dissemination and outreach events, including state-level presentations where we're hosted by national ministries, NGOs and others, and some of my colleagues undertake those disseminations. And at those meetings, we actually bring in members of the communities where we've done the research to try and get feedback. We translate at a minimum the summaries and our policy briefing papers. We would like to translate more. We translated actually a 600-page training manual into Arabic on pastoralism so that it can be used by national facilitators. We'd like to translate more, but it's expensive. And we disseminate at every possible opportunity, whether it's one-to-one briefings with ministers, breakfasts, whenever. So, and that's built in from the beginning. And it's not just our immediate team, it's people amongst our partners. So, for example, while Yusuf is with us, one of our colleagues from another NGO is disseminating on our behalf in Darfur. So the network spreads. We're really building a network that is not just dependent, well, it's certainly not dependent on us, but is more self-sustaining.
Thank you. Now, overstocking and range management. I think this should be you, should it? Was it? No? Severa, okay.
Okay. First, I would like to make clear that when I talked about intrinsic factors or external factors, it wasn't about sort of shifting responsibilities. Do pastoralists or livestock keepers operate in ways that at times are problematic for the environment or even in terms of cause problems for conflict and so on? Yes, of course they do. They often do. Are these ways of operating inherent to the logic of pastoral production? No, they're not. And that's why we need to be able to make a distinction. If the fundamental logic of exploiting non-equilibrium environments consists in arriving on the pasture just at the right time and only use the most nutritious part of it and then move on. So consists in being very selective in picking only the most nutrient part of it. No? You imagine a very large plate with a couscous or rice and bits of meat and more nutritious food. And what they do, they only pick the meat and leave the rice on the pasture. That's the image that we often use. By necessity, that means that there is no overgrazing according to the logic of pastoral systems, because overgrazing would imply lower returns. You don't want the animals to eat everything. That's precisely the key of the logic of pastoral production. You want your animals only to eat the best parts of the pasture and move on. And by doing that, you will be able to keep them on a diet that is of a high nutritional level than the average nutritional level of the range they are grazing. That's the point. The minute you have to make use of lower quality pasture, you're already forced into a space that you would rather not be. That's the thing. So when we talk about sedentary farmers keeping livestock, when we talk about degradation of pasture because of increased sedentarization or less mobility of livestock, to an extent, also when we talk about overstocking, which is directly linked to not being able to move your animals, you can only overstock in a given space. We are still talking of distortions. You can imagine the system of mobility as a circulatory system. No? If you stop the circulation in one place, you'll have some effect, swelling, or you'll have a traffic jam, or you'll have things like that. No? And obviously, we are now in a situation in which there are very frequent traffic jams, and the solutions suggested by the administration is to stop the circulation of cars altogether. Clearly, that is not the way to go.
I can't resist saying that answer assumes that your pastoralist herder is going to adopt the best policy in the interests of his community, which may not be the best policy for his own herds. In other words, is he going to stop his herds from grazing rather than overgraze a particular area if he's got there? Or if somebody who is weaker wants to come and share the grazing, is he going to allow that, or is he going to fend off the competition? So I think, theoretically, you ought to be right if everybody behaves in a really good
stopping overgrazing
way.
is in the interest of the pastoralist. It's not in the interest of the community, because overgrazing means underfeeding. It's very important to understand that ruminants cannot compensate lack of quality with quantity. They will not eat more if the diet is poorer. They will eat less and lose weight very quickly in rangeland contests, in the dryland areas. So if the diet is of poor quality, no cow will eat more to compensate. They cannot do that. No, the post-feeding experience will tell them that there is no point in wasting time in eating, and they will stop feeding. They will spend more time resting, and they will lose weight very quickly. So it is not in the personal interest of the herder to have the animals eating everything. When the quality is uneven, when the quality of the grass is uneven, it's not in the interest of the individual herder. So if they do that, it's because they don't see any better option ahead. They cannot move because of conflict, because of costs of moving, because they will have to go long distances because the road is blocked. They will have to use transport and so on. So the way most pastors are operating today is by making very difficult compromises between the cost of operating and the ideal strategies they would follow. Those who cannot go to the south anymore, they have to make do with inadequate pasture they find in the north, and they balance that between going to places where they couldn't really go because there is no water, and then funding for water to be transported there if they can afford it, or keeping the animals near the water and then funding for feed to be transported there. So they are forced in situations which they would rather not be, and crop residues are notoriously less nutritious than good pasture, even dry pasture. So is not a better solution to feed animals with crop residues. Is a compromise in those conditions, especially dryland crop residues, which is usually failed harvest.
So the answer to Mr. Wilder's question is that you can't improve range management because the logic of the animals and the herders between them manages it in the best possible way.
No, you can improve it by favoring this logic to happen. No? We are operating in a situation in which it's very difficult to apply this logic, because for 60 years we've done everything to undermine this way of operating. So no, absolutely, there is plenty of room for improvement, and there is also room for improvement by using technologies. It is perfectly possible to improve the way best pastures are tracked. It's possible to help the mobility of livestock, making it faster, making it easier through the use of technologies. It's just that there is no effort in that direction because the problem is always pinned on the fact that mobile livestock exist, and therefore the solution is to stop it. There is no understanding that it is not the logic of pastoral system that creates a problem. It's the fact they cannot operate according to that logic.
Thank you. Said Yusuf.
Thank you very much. I mean, Mohammed has actually raised something we very much struggle with in Sudan. And the reason why we struggle with this is that the misperception is promoted by the most learned and educated people in Sudan. And we have two expressions. One is, for example, the intensification of agriculture. And when they talk about intensification of agriculture, they don't think about a negative damage on natural resources because the promoted official policy on agriculture is the increase of production and productivity, not giving any attention to the natural resource management. When it comes to grazing, the term used, overgrazing, is translated in Arabic as ar-ra'i jair. Jair in Arabic means you do something violently and legally. But when it comes to mechanized agriculture, when it comes to extractive industry, when it comes to blocked access to natural resource use by whoever, that is not looked into as equally as negative as when the pastoral communities use the natural resources. I think when we talk about the management of natural resources in dry environment, we need to look at the previous indigenous natural resource practices existed or continue to exist in places like Sudan. What I think is under-researched is, in fact, the fact that how these people continued for over the last 60 years, as correctly says, or even there beyond, and why things are actually quite disturbed at the moment. A lot of places in Sudan at the moment are taken away from pastoral communities, which were well managed by indigenous knowledge and by communities in the interest not only of the pastoralists, but also for other communities. And once the pastoral communities are denied both management and access to those resources, the whole equation is disrupted and is now very much violently operating in our situation in Sudan. I think the land issue should go to someone else.
Well, Said Yusuf says modestly he's not going to tackle the land issue, but I'm not going to move on until somebody tackles it. Abdul Hafiz, is this your moment?
No, that's one land issue. I've got something else to say about
Okay.
that.
Okay. Helen, then.
All right. Just on the land issue, land is a source of power. Well, just a recap, I think we all know that in Darfur, in Sudan generally, there's a plurality of land tenure arrangements. National policies are such that all land that wasn't registered in the 70s is in theory owned by the government. And so basically, but at a local level, you have management of land under the tribal administration, the Hokura system. And of course, within Darfur, you have the tribal homelands, or Dar. So the administration of that Hokura, the responsibility for that rests with the tribal administration. Now, we have a researcher at Tufts University called Abdul Maneem Osman, and he recently undertook, his PhD is on changing land tenure arrangements, changing land use practices in relation to changing land use practices and links with the conflict. And one of the findings from his work was that there has been a massive shift to individual land tenure arrangements. So, for example, within a village in, say, Keb Kabir, people are getting their land through their inheritance of that individual tenure, as opposed to it being allocated or reallocated by the tribal leadership. Now, so I just wanted to kind of point out that there are these different arrangements, but land as a source of power, the tribal Dar, ownership of a tribal Dar, is basically a source of political power because it provides a constituency that enables political representation representation in the National Assembly. So, for example, if you control a Dar, it's more likely that you're going to return your man to, and get that seat in Khartoum. But it also gives potentially control of an area. Now, in the past in Darfur, those Dars were very heterogeneous. So there were multiple tribes living in these particular Dars. But recent trends, particularly where we've been working in East Darfur, is a polarization. For example, in East Darfur, as a result of the conflict between the Rizigat and the Malia, there's been a kind of polarization between those groups and a concentration of groups in particular areas. That is a disaster for pastoralists because the Malia are also Bagara, and the Malia traditionally would also migrate down to the south and go into South Sudan, etc. Among the Malia, they're reporting a shift into sheep, because sheep do not have to move so far. So that's a conflict avoidance strategy. So I feel like I've just made some general comments on this land issue. When you read our report, you will get a much more coherent analysis. But in relation to your comment on the payment for safe passage, it's actually incredibly complicated. But you have a situation where different groups control different areas. So who is charging for the payment will depend entirely on where you are and who has the power in that area. And it is not just we can't just say it's pastoralists. It's complicated.
Thank you very much. Lauren, can we squeeze out another round of questions, or are you going to throw us out?
I think she's not in here anymore.
Good. In that case, in her absence, we'll have another round of questions.
Thank you. My name is Ed Barry. I'm with the Sustainable World Initiative, and we study the relationship between natural resources and human well-being at a macro level, at a global scale. And one of the things we notice, we believe that there's a growing awareness in the international development community that humanity in total is more or less now, because of the large scale of our collective activities, is really overutilizing natural resources around the world. I'm wondering if you would comment on whether you see that same thing going on in Darfur, and maybe putting it in perspective. We understand that the population of Sudan is projected to grow from 45 million to like 90 million by 2050. How would that play into this broader question? Thank you.
Anyone else with a burning question? This is the last chance. A lady at the back.
Thanks. Can you hear me? My name is Dina Brick. I'm with Catholic Relief Services and actually an alum of the Feinstein Center. I have sort of a general question. I know that gender relations in this area are quite unique. And I'm just wondering, I didn't hear very much about how the work that you've done has taken into account, what kind of a gender analysis you've done. In particular, Margie, you were mentioning some different opportunities for cash crops and pastoral marketing. So I'm just curious, sort of at 5 or 50,000 feet, what you've seen in that sense.
Okay, the expert of Darfur will answer the first question.
Oh, you'd like...
I don't know who that is, but you're all experts.
I'll do the gender one. Yeah.
Sorry, I've lost track.
Well, let Margie do gender, and then
Yeah.
and then we'll ask Helen to
Okay.
take the other one and wind up.
Yeah, so on the gender issue, it is something we pay quite a lot of attention to. Actually, there's much more particularly in the forthcoming cash crop report. There'll be a lot more in it than we presented now. And a few things to mention. One was we looked at the division of labor in agricultural activities in cash crop farming, and discovered in many areas actually women seem to be carrying even more of the burden of cash crop production, particularly in insecure areas where there's concerns that if men go into the fields, they're more likely to be killed. Women may be harassed, but are less likely to be killed. And there's quite interesting indications of the increasing burden that they seem to be carrying in some areas of cash crop production. And The other couple of areas to mention would be petty trading. There's some of the large-scale trade, as that's declined, there's been this rise in petty trading, which is very much dominated by women. And there is some really interesting work to be done beyond what we've found out. To what extent is that representing an economic empowerment of women versus to what extent are actually women carrying, more and more of the economic burden for their households? So there's some quite interesting work to be looked at there. And then informal trade, cross-border trade. There's, again, evidence of women playing a very important role in the informal trade, particularly from West Darfur into Chad. Yeah, and then some of the areas of economic opportunity, for example, the leather industry. One of the reasons we had gender implications there is because that's a sector that's very much where women are very much employed and involved, and so there are some real opportunities. But it's always got to be looked at in terms of, as women are taking on more of the economic burden, to what extent is that positive, and to what extent does that become negative?
Thank you. Helen, you've got overgrazing in another rather subtle guise. Are humans using too many natural resources?
Yes. Well, I feel like we've covered a lot of this ground already. When you first asked that question of overutilizing natural resources in Darfur, the first thought that came to mind was, well, who are we talking about? Because actually one of the big issues about overutilizing natural resources that's come up in our recent discussions relates to the international community, and particularly the how many peacekeepers are now in Darfur, and where are they living, and what is how much water does your average peacekeeper use in the context of, in an area that's on the edge of the Sahara? So I really think we need to get these things into perspective. And also, if we're going to have a sensible discussion on it, we need data and evidence. And our data is obviously limited, but I do think it's a starting point for looking at this particular issue. I want to go on and just respond a little bit on the gender question. The work on land tenure that I mentioned, Abdulmenim Osman, indicates very strongly that in this shift in land tenure arrangements, it's women that have been squeezed out, particularly in that winter cultivation that traditionally they would have been responsible for. I think I'd argue very strongly we need to do much, much more on gender analysis, but I will not be apologetic from this perspective of there is a dearth of assessments and research on pastoralism, full stop. So if I ask the international community, what proportion of the groups are you working with? What proportion of them are pastoralists? What are their human development indicators? What's the rates of maternal mortality? What's the child malnutrition? I can't get any answers. So this challenge is across the board. And in our own work, we see that, first of all, we need an entry point to these communities. And livestock production and productivity and their livelihood system is their priority. So we have to, we are speaking to that priority, and by working with that, we have an opportunity then to branch out and look at some of these gender issues, because they are crucial. But you cannot go straight in and look at them without having that relationship to start with.
Yusuf wants to comment on the population of Sudan.
Yeah, probably a few years back, the Sudan population was around 42 million. And I think that population is at the moment cut by 33%, following the independence of South Sudan into an independent state. It is true that the growth rate in Sudan is amongst the highest growth rates, probably in Africa or close to the countries neighbors to us. But I really don't see the relationship between a growing population in a country rich in resources like Sudan, as compared to the problems that may arise. I think we need to look at the population growth results and also how to well manage our resources. But that is not being done at the moment. I think in the next 50 years, we'll have a growing population in Sudan, but we will have decreased resources not because of the growth of population, it's probably because of other external factors.
Please join me in thanking all our sponsors and Helen Young and her team for a fascinating morning.